Because what's happening is you have a situation where you have a governor who, when he was there, empowered lots of bandits to win election. They are known as people who sponsor, insecurity in their state.
Mm-hmm.
And then the president makes that such a person minister of defense, for example. So clearly, it's like turkeys voting for Christmas. It's not going to happen.
Right.
West Africa is increasingly defined not just by instability, but by its position within a shifting global order. A widening arc of insecurity stretches across the Sahel, where millions have been displaced and where violence is no longer contained within borders, but shaped by forces that move across them.
Nigeria sits at the center of that reality, a country confronting overlapping threats, insurgency, banditry, and criminal economics. Nigeria sits at the center of that reality, a country confronting overlapping threats, insurgency, banditry, and criminal economies, but also navigating deeper questions about the state capacity, legitimacy, and its role within a changing geopolitical landscape.
This is no longer simply a domestic or even regional story. Across the Lake Chad Basin alone, over 30 million people have been affected by conflict. At the same time, external factors are re-emerging, alliances are shifting, and West Africa is increasingly becoming a space where global power is negotiated.
Our guest operates at that intersection of those dynamics, a geopolitical analyst focused on how Africa engages with power, perception, and global systems, and how those forces shape outcomes on the ground.
Charles Omole joins us to examine a harder question: when insecurity becomes systemic and when regional crises intersect with global competition. What does it actually mean for Africa to define and defend its own security?
From Cairo to Cape Town, Lagos to Lamu, 54 nations, one continent, countless perspectives. Hi, I'm Waweru Njoroge.
Hi, I'm Njoroge.
Welcome to Panel 54, a global perspective through an African lens. This is the podcast where we unpack power, policy, people, and the paradoxes that define our time, with nuance, with history, and with a deliberate commitment to context. This isn't punditry, it's perspective. It's not a briefing, it's a reframing, and it starts right here. What we've explored today is not just a security crisis, but a system under pressure, a system where local instability intersects with regional fragility and where both are increasingly shaped by global power dynamics.
We've looked at how insecurity in Nigeria is not isolated, but connected to the Sahel, to governance structures, and to the way external actors engage with the region.
We've also examined how power operates within that system, not only through force, but through influence, perception, and the ability to shape outcomes beyond borders.
And at the center of it all is a question of agency, whether states are responding to events or actively shaping the environment in which they operate.
Because in a world where power is contested, security is no longer just about control. It's about positioning, alignment, and the ability to act with clarity within complexity. Well, thank you, Dr. Omole, for joining us on Panel 54. It's a pleasure to have you here. We're going to jump straight into it. Now, you've built your work around analyzing Africa's place within global power structures, from security to geopolitics to internal perceptions. Before we get into the actual substance of today's Panel 54, what experiences have most shaped how you think about power, security, and Africa's position in the world?
Yes, thank you. Thanks for having me. My perspectives on power, security, and Africa's global position has been profoundly shaped by a combination of factors, including my research and extensive engagement across the different nations of Africa. I understand the interplay between regional instability and global power structures, particularly how narratives of African fragility, as I call it, how that is weaponized in geopolitical context, especially in the West. These experiences collectively taught me that Africa's security challenges, they are not isolated, but they're deeply, and that's the key here, that they're deeply intertwined with the economic dependencies, governance deficit, and the structural and strategic inequalities that together with, of course, interest of external factors. This intertwine of different elements, I think, necessitates a more holistic approach to African security that prioritizes African agency over external prescription. So I think it's just that the multi-causal factors of the insecurity in Africa, it's a bit that I think has been underplayed by many commentaries.
So you obviously sit at the intersection of policy, then we're looking at geopolitics and narrative. What do you think, as we look at all of these things in tandem, is the most misunderstood across board?
Well, good question. I mean, for me, the most profound misunderstanding, I think, lies in the global framing of Africa's security challenges as primarily terrorism-driven or resource conflict, which obscures the deeper structural issues of governance failure, economic marginalization, and historical inequities across many of the nations in Africa. Internationally, these threats are often sensationalized through media narratives that portray Africa as a, perpetual crisis zone, ignoring the continent's resilience and the role of external players in perpetuating instability in some African countries. You see arms proliferation, economic exploitation, all kinds of things happening all over the place. So I think the misunderstanding is that the misunderstanding for me is a question of this narrative, like I said, which misrepresents Africa, and that leads to engagement strategies that prioritizes military intervention and counterterrorism over long-term investment in institution building and capacity development in Africa, as well as socio-economic development. So in reality, Africa's security landscape is a tapestry of interconnected grievances, in my opinion, where insurgencies, banditry, communal violence stem from unaddressed inequalities, making global responses that treat symptoms rather than the root causes ineffective and counterproductive.
Okay. Well, let's look at Nigeria. I mean, a complete mix of many of these things that you mentioned is described as facing multiple security crises at once. Insurgency in the northeast, with what we saw as what is now being referred to as the Palm Sunday attacks. There's banditry in the northwest, kidnapping economies across regions. Oil theft in the delta. But when everything is framed as a crisis, it becomes difficult to prioritize. What's the biggest misunderstanding about Nigeria's security problem today?
Well, for me, the single biggest misunderstanding is that Nigeria faces desperate, unrelated crises that stand on their own in silos, rather than a cohesive system of insecurity driven by underlying governance failure and socioeconomic disparity. For example, in Nigeria, we found out that despite having about 5,350 police posts and units, there are still 25 to 30% of the land area of Nigeria that have no police presence at all. So we have ungoverned spaces. This fragmented view leads to siloed responses, like I said. Military operation in the northeast, community policing in the northwest, without recognizing how banditry, insurgency, and oil theft are interconnected through networks of criminality, corruption, and weak state presence. In fact, there are reports that in Nigeria, insecurity has become an economic issue, economic factor. So you start by being a terrorist, you're making some money there, the government comes to attack, you decide that, okay, terrorism, maybe I should stop that, then you go into banditry, you made some money there, government maybe bring some programs to attack it. You decide, actually, kidnapping is a bit safer. So you go to kidnapping, and then government starts on that. I mean, all I'm trying to say is, it's economic stupid, like they say in the US. It's the fact that there is now an economic imperative for insecurity. People see we're making good, quick money. Therefore, once that becomes a factor, the criminality I get involved in becomes irrelevant. What's driving me is the economic imperative.
Yeah. Okay.
So if the underlying economic issues, socio-economic problem, poverty, if that's not addressed, nation will just move from one form of criminality to another.
Okay. I want to focus now on adaptive threats and basic systemic failures. There is a pattern that we do see repeatedly. Basically, it's heavy deployment, then there's a few tactical wins, but very little long-term degradation of these actual networks, which you just mentioned just now. What does this tell us about the gap in terms of security, basically between security and how it's approached and how these systems actually function?
Well, I mean, the pattern that's implied in your question highlights, I think, a critical gap between kinetic, force-heavy approaches and the adaptive networked nature of these threats, which thrives on resilience and the constitution rather than hierarchical structure. Tactical wins, such as clearing a camp, that happens all the time in Nigeria. The military will announce, we've gone to this village, we've, killed so many terrorists. All this clearing up or capturing leaders fail to degrade networks because they operate through decentralized cells, economic incentives, and community embeddedness. So you can capture the leader, kill some people. It doesn't stop the threat. I mean, data from Global Terrorism Database shows that insurgent groups in Nigeria have persisted despite more than 100 major military operations in Nigeria since 2015, adapting by shifting tactics, forming alliances, exploiting government vacuums. So you even have them working together where one fits the other. Okay, we'll provide you money. The kidnappers, okay, we'll provide you money. You provide us protection from government. So you see even the criminals working together.
Yeah.
This reveals that security approaches must integrate intelligence-led strategies, economic development, and community engagement to address the systemic function of these networks, not just occasional kinetic activities.
And we're seeing that there's an overlap, Dr. Omole, between bandit groups and jihadist actors, alluding to what you've kind of just said. Does that suggest that we are no longer dealing with distinct threats, but a blended system of insecurity?
That is true. No. I mean, like I said, the problem, especially in a country like Nigeria, is everybody thinks in silos, and the dots are not joined. So you are right in the sense that it's no. I mean, the everything is interwoven now. The threats facing the country. I mean, there are reports in Nigeria, for example, of people who have been arrested for a particular, crime, and then the government was trying to do some form of repentant Boko Haram. For example, you arrest them, so they are repentant. So let's kind of integrate them into society.
Yeah.
Those guys leave and then they start kidnapping.
Okay, now Dua just mentioned this. There was a recent attack in Plateau State over Palm Sunday. Dozens were killed. I think the number was about 28. And a curfew has now been imposed. These incidents, and I think you've alluded to this well, are no longer isolated or actually remote. They seem to be recurring, they seem to be visible and increasingly embedded within civilian life itself. At what point does this stop being an insurgency problem and becomes a broader question on national stability and state resilience?
Well, this incident transition from insurgency to a national stability crisis when they disrupt economic activities, erode public trust, and challenge state authority across multiple regions. Like you said, the example is one in Plateau. Then we have a situation where farmers in many states cannot go to their farms because of insecurity. These communal clashes in Nigeria, I think since 2020, based on numbers, have displaced over 200,000 people.
Mm-hmm.
So we have imposition of curfews and the normalization of violence, indicate a failure of state resilience, in my opinion, where insecurity becomes embedded in daily life. People factor that into everything they do. Data from World Bank, for example, shows that instability has cost Nigeria billions in lost GDP, signaling that the problem now threatens national cohesion and requires a holistic reform beyond the military containment. The challenge in Nigeria is that the figures as of 2 years ago is that Nigeria has about 85 armed non-state groups. So that more like guns for hire. And what this means, and a lot of these groups were actually formed by politicians.
Okay.
Politicians who import illegally weapons in, make them political thugs to allow them to help them win elections. And once they win the elections, they abandon these people with the weapons. So these people now say, what do we do with the weapons? They start a criminal enterprise. And so that's littered all over the country. And then when they have personal scores with communities, they send these people almost like mercenaries, so to speak, local mercenaries to go and fight local communities.
Okay.
So it's like almost like a revolving door that needs to be dealt with.
I mean, it's almost ludicrous, but we may not have understood exactly what it is that you said. There are politicians who are involved in ensuring that this state of insecurity is introduced in the first place, and then they abandon the thing into it, but then somehow you depend on a state system which is governed or vanguarded by these same politicians to essentially solve the problem. What does this then say about state capacity when response mechanisms will be reactive when Plateau State happens on Palm Sunday, for example, when we have the same politicians involved in the genesis of the thing in the beginning?
That's a very good question. I mean, in many of my media appearances in the last several weeks, I've said it, in fact, over a year now, I've said it repeatedly that one of the fundamental things the president of Nigeria can do, for example, is to make sure that all appointments, all posts that relates to national security should be manned by technocrats, not politicians.
Okay.
Because what's happening is you have a situation where you have a governor who, when he was there, empowered lots of bandits to win election. They are known as people who sponsor insecurity in their state. And then the president makes that such a person Minister of Defense, for example. So clearly, it's like turkeys voting for Christmas. It's not going to happen.
Right.
So the whole idea is get people who have no skin in the game to man our security-related portfolios so that they can deal with it without any bias. But as long as the leaders, the president, keep appointing politicians, professional politicians who have stood for elections into these posts, then even if they're fighting insecurity, they're in an indirect way using that post to deplete the opposition, rather than fighting insecurity in a holistic fashion, in a balanced way.
If I may, so does that give rise to any credibility when we saw now the resignation of a defense minister in Nigeria just before Christmas last year? Does that speak to them not being able or having the capacity to deal with this matter? Or then the conscience issue whereby these things continue to happen and they can't or won't do anything about it?
Well, I mean, we can only ask that guesses. I mean, the minister who was effectively sacked. Really, he wasn't. It wasn't. People don't resign in Nigeria,
right? In Africa.
So he was effectively sacked. But the issue is in terms of state capacity. The challenge we have here is. I think Nigeria as a nation has created problems that are now coming home to roost. Let me give an example. Take the Niger Delta. We have, hundreds of miles of pipelines for crude oil in Nigeria. Now, they were sort of, the militants in the Niger Delta were going there, damaging the pipelines here and there. Rather than the government equipping its own state-owned security agencies to deal with it, what did they do? They now brought in one of the top militants. They now gave him a contract of which we are paying about 6-7 billion every month to this militant to help guard or secure the pipelines. So what you now have is it's been going on for a few years now. So you now have a situation where a non-state actor now knows the entire tapestry of our pipelines, has been empowered to billions of naira, has security equipment, has men. How do you end that kind of contract, for example? What happens when you decide you don't want that contract?
Right.
What does he now do with the knowledge he has? And that is the problem we have. So Nigeria has created all kinds of monsters all over the place. And it almost looks like we're going to be in perpetual insecurity. But again, linking to what I said earlier, it's all about economics. Because it's all about the money they make. So you now have a whole army of people in Nigeria who are used to big bucks without any work. You see them in hotels, you see them in social events, where they spend money. There's no way you could have worked out for your money and be spending it like this.
No.
Right.
So if they are used to that lifestyle, withdrawing such a contract, for example, they will just simply go back to bunkering.
Okay. I want to zoom out a bit.
So there's a bit of state capture happening there, and that's a problem.
I want to zoom out a bit. Now, Nigeria does not operate in isolation. Instability across the actual Sahel has accelerated. We've seen a lot of coups. We've seen weakened state authority, cross-border movement of armed groups. On Niger, actually, specifically, the debate around intervention has been deeply, deeply divided. From your perspective, how should Nigeria think about its role within that crisis?
Well, I think Nigeria should approach its role in the Niger crisis through a lens of regional solidarity and strategic restraint, prioritizing diplomatic engagement and humanitarian support over unilateral military intervention. It was one Nigerian, I think it was Sonny Abacha, one of Nigerian former military junta, that said that because it was reported that all the coups in Nigeria since 1960, since 1966, Abacha has been involved. And one of the things he said, the famous quote, is that a military coup is not possible unless there is a wide disenchantment with civilian rule among the population. So, in other words, if there is a high satisfaction rate by the people, a coup would be difficult to consummate. So, given historical ties and shares, for example, back to Niger, large shared borders we have with the country, Nigeria must balance, I think, its security interest with the risk of escalation. For example, the military coup. One of the things that was helping to deal with Boko Haram a few years back was the multinational joint task force, which was made up of military from Niger, Nigeria, Chad, and because what happened was that when the Nigerian military starts an operation, those guys run into the next country, and then Nigeria will have to stop. But the multinational joint task force, it doesn't matter where you go, they continue the pursuit. But what happened after the coup happened is that multinational joint task force has broken down because they withdrew from their cooperation. So now the country, so Nigeria has now become a haven again because the country is no longer cooperating on the ECOWAS level on security matters, and that I think is a problem. Intervention debates highlight divisions, in West Africa, but Nigerians' leadership, I think, should emphasize non-kinetic tools more to win hearts and minds, in Niger to secure their cooperation.
If in the region as we see it, the greater region, if force is not sufficient, does a regional strategy what does it look like for regional strategy in a space where state authority is uneven? I mean, you've mentioned some of these countries already. We're seeing what it looks like. And non-state actors are increasingly embedded, again, to an example that you've given. What does it look like if force doesn't work? We've tried that before. It doesn't seem to quite work. Dealing with, of course, Nigeria's internal struggle and then being a lead military advancement. If that doesn't work, does conversation work?
Well, I mean, I wouldn't call it just conversation. I would say there's a book I, launched last year, looking at what I call non-kinetic approach to insecurity in Nigeria, and that book was inspired by one of the intelligence reports I read a few years back, when somebody was one of the Boko Haram, one was suspected, the Boko Haram guy was arrested. And when was asked, why did you join the terrorist group? He explained the story how in his village, he came home, he found the richest man in the village with his wife in the north. And he reported the matter to the police. That, look, this guy is my wife. What's he doing there? The police were bribed. So instead of dealing with the police arrested the husband, and detained him for a month, in their cell. So the guy was very angry. So he said, when he was released, he told himself that we take revenge. So when the Boko Haram guys came to recruit him, the first thing that came to his mind is, that's my opportunity to exact my revenge. So he joined the Boko Haram, and after he was given basic training, the first attack he led was to that police station, where he killed all the police officers.
Wow.
Now, perception of people is Boko Haram, they're all Islamic fundamentalists. That's not true. That's a simplistic approach. It's a broad church. There are people there for all kinds of reasons. So if you are looking at solution, therefore, you need to strip away those who join such groups for economic and similar reasons. And then you will now expose the core terrorists on their own.
Okay.
So it means there has to be economic development. I mean, part of the challenge in Nigeria is that the development you go to some space in Borno State. If you take the photograph today, it's exactly the way these places were in 1975. It's as though the government has not been present there at all.
Right.
So when you have such poverty, and then there was a time we were told that, for example, Boko Haram were paying their soldiers $100 a month at some point. That is way more than the minimum wage in Nigeria. So it's economic factors. So when Nigeria, all the African countries, you need to focus on empowering the people, alleviating poverty, creating jobs, socio-economic development. That, for me, will make it easier to deal with the core criminals rather than what I call subsistence criminal.
Okay, now we're seeing growing external involvement, as you've mentioned, primarily across the Sahel, actually. We're looking at from Russian-linked networks to renewed Western interests and Western engagement. What changes when these conflicts become part of a wider geopolitical contest?
Well, the Sahel has evolved into an extension of Nigeria's internal security reality. My view, with cross-border movements of armed groups and shared vulnerabilities, even making boundaries unnecessary, because these people just move in and out of countries. Incidents like the infiltration of jihadist elements from Mali into Nigeria's northeast, for example, demonstrates integration, that these people are working together. So Nigeria must treat the Sahel as interconnected, adopting strategies, I think, that address the internal and external dimension. A credible regional strategy, in my view, it will have to integrate force with diplomacy, development, and intelligence sharing. The weakness of ECOWAS, for example, is a major factor. Forget AU. AU is far from being in existence in many parts of West Africa.
Right.
ECOWAS is more known, but the ECOWAS has not clothed itself in glory because it has not been seen as an organization that promotes good governance. When the civilian governments are doing bad things, ECOWAS is completely silent. Suddenly, when military government takes over, ECOWAS starts shouting, and people, now are telling ECOWAS to shut up. That where were you when the so-called civilian government was oppressing us? So I think the credibility of multilateral institutions is a major problem, but it has to be done at an ECOWAS level rather than internal. Of course, the presence of some what do you call them now, mercenaries introduced by some of these countries changes the dynamics a little bit, which shows that both political and military strategy is not being driven by Western interests, and that is a problem.
Can Nigeria realistically improve security outcomes without addressing deeper governance issues, trust, corruption? We're talking about institutional coherence. Are these challenges inseparable from the security question itself?
Well, I mean, I've mentioned that these challenges are inseparable. Nigeria cannot achieve sustained security or any improvement in security without tackling governance issues, as corruption and institutional incoherence, fuel thefts, and all kinds of things going on. Reforms in transparency, accountability, and service delivery, in my opinion, are essential to rebuilding trust and addressing root causes, making security outcomes dependent on holistic governance enhancement. So the challenges are they're inseparable, in my opinion. One feeds the other, and that's what I'm saying. I said Nigeria military have carried out over 100 different operations against the terrorists, but yet, nothing has improved. So it tells you that we cannot militarily win this war, so to speak.
Okay.
We have to do socio-economic development.
If we're looking ahead, what is actually the greater risk? A resurgence of violence or the gradual erosion of state authority legitimacy?
Well, the greater risk is the gradual erosion of state authority and legitimacy, in my view, as it enables resurgence of violence and undermines long-term stability. In Nigeria, for example, declining trust in institutions evidenced by low approval ratings of anything government, that creates a fertile ground for threats necessitating urgent reforms to preserve state resilience. It's the state authority is being eroded, and like I said, with over 80 armed non-state groups in Nigeria alone, that tells you that the state monopoly of violence or of weapons is no longer exists. There are now people who have their right, if that right amount. I mean, there was a guy who was killed by the military a few years ago in Nigeria. But before he was killed, he's from a state in Nigeria called Benue State. He gave an interview, and he said that he was approached to go and destabilize a particular state, and he asked the people for 1 billion naira, and he said they only gave him 600 million, and he told them that's not enough. That if they give him 1 billion, so in other words, if they give him the 1 billion naira, he will have gone to that state to cause trouble. Who would think it's terrorism? Who would think it's banditry? Meanwhile, these are sponsored insecurity deliberately. Why? Because in that particular state, the politicians are using their illegal workers to do illegal mining of gold and mineral resources.
Okay.
So they need to create insecurity as a diversion, so to speak, for to allow them to carry on, exploiting those mineral resources. So everything is linked to economics.
Okay. The United States has supported Nigeria's security efforts for years through training, intelligence, advisory roles. It's always been present. But beyond that tactical layer, what role does this partnership play in shaping Nigeria's strategic position within a shifting global order?
Well, for me, I think the key thing that the U.S. cooperation with Nigeria can provide are things that are lacking. One of the major deficits in our security infrastructure is effective intelligence, and the United States can easily provide that in terms of what's happening, but in terms of the actual work, Nigeria, I think, is capable of doing the actual military operations. The problem is intelligence, and I think it also provides geopolitical leverage, intelligence cooperation, diplomatic backing, helping Nigeria to navigate emerging powers like China and Russia. So I think the cooperation is a good one, because the rumor that Nigeria will have a U.S. base is wrong. The U.S. bases are not here. But in my own personal opinion and from my experience, one of the key things I think the U.S. presence would do is that it will help shape the response of the Nigerian military. One of the fundamental weaknesses of our military response in Nigeria is that our military have been infiltrated by sympathizers of terrorists. So, for example, an operation is planned, before you know it, the details are leaked to the bad guys. And then by the time you get to the location, the bad guys are all gone. So the challenge, therefore, is with the presence of Americans, it will help reduce that, because and the Americans, by the way, they are aware. So what they are doing is they are working with a very close-knit small group of leadership in the military, rather than a wide sharing of information that leaks to the bad guys. So I think it's a win-win situation for the country. But the danger in this, though, is I'm hoping it doesn't create dependency, because there has to be, like Kenya did, there has to be, Kenya did with AFRICOM, the American military, is that one of the conditions is there has to be capacity development locally. Otherwise, it will create dependency, and once Americans leave, we're in trouble again. So that, I think, is the key thing Nigerian government should focus on.
Okay.
Knowledge transfer.
You just mentioned capacity, and I'm looking at the aspect of that tension between what capacity looks like in terms of capacity building and actual dependency, which you've touched on as well. Where is that line drawn, and how does Nigeria maintain ownership of its security and architecture within these partnerships?
Well, there has to be. There has to be some form of, in the agreement signed right from the beginning. There has to be some benchmarks, put in there, and that benchmark will determine in terms of 100% in year one, will now be providing only 40% in year three, for example, because the 70% is not being done by people locally. So there has to be benchmark for knowledge transfer. There has to be benchmark for capacity development, within the Nigerian armed forces. And otherwise, like I said, if it's all done, do it for us, then the dependency will create a major problem, because that will also create gaps in our knowledge as a country. So it's how this is managed by the Nigerian military and Nigerian government as a whole, I think is critical to whether it becomes a dependency issue or something we can leverage in 4 or 5 years' time. We will have learned a lot, and then the need for Americans will be less important, and then we can stand on our own. But if that's not done, we're in trouble.
Okay. How important is that in determining not just effectiveness, but influence?
Well, I mean, the thing is, Americans, they do want to have a say. I mean, what's happening in Africa as a whole. I think part of the challenge, for example, with the Americans is they see, almost, they perceive a sort of anti-Western or anti-imperialist sentiments in many countries in Africa, with, for example, what the Francophone countries are doing with France. So it's almost like, Americans, therefore, don't want to lose influence, to speak. We've seen some of those countries that and I think one American was telling me the other day that there's not so much of anti-imperialist, but anti-particular countries. Mm-hmm. What he meant by that is you see some of the countries that are severing their relationship with France are pivoting towards Russia. Mm-hmm. For example, mm-hmm. So you're almost like replacing one imperialist with another. So it shows that the direction is not so much of anti-external factors, but anti a particular nation is what is happening. So America perceived that as an opportunity for them to gain more hold in terms of soft power across many of African countries. And I think that is what is making them increase the budget for Africa has more than doubled under Trump. So the idea is they're trying to pump money to secure their influence. But for a country like Nigeria, that I think my fear, like I said, is that it can become a factor where we become dependent on the Americans, and therefore the influence of Nigeria is weakened overall because Americans now have more leverage.
But on that note, Dr. Omole, how then should Nigeria and West Africa as a whole basically position themselves rather than looking at being talked to and start demanding? So how do they position themselves in this particular space, ensuring that they're not simply arenas for external competitors?
Well, I mean, I think what I think is missing here, if you ask me, quite frankly, what I think is missing here is this. You have different countries, China, Russia, America, Britain, France. You have all these countries, fighting over which country they want to have influence over. But what is missing here is intra-African cooperation. That actually that is the biggest problem. So you have these non-African countries exerting influence, but Nigeria and Niger, just, next of the border, we are not cooperating. The challenge, I think the biggest problem is it's almost like colonialism have not finished, so to speak, because the artificial borders created by the colonialists have created this situation where African countries generally do not work together. I mean, for example, I did a research a few years ago where the only country in Africa at that time, South Africa, is the only country that was producing a military jet. It was called Cheetah. And then that military jet program had to be closed by South Africa because not a single African country patronized them.
Right.
So you have a situation where you have African Free Trade Agreement, everything is on paper. Africa generally is not cooperating. If you want to travel across every African country right now, you need at least 35 visas, to go across Africa. So you can see, when the European Union was formed after the Second World War, the whole idea is we don't want countries in Europe fighting each other. And then they made a decision that if we're economically interdependent, we will not fight each other. And that has worked. So we have a situation in Africa where that doesn't happen. Every country is a silo. So until Africa begins to, work, integrate among themselves, so to speak, that's what we shut out the external elements. Until that happens, we are just, easy pick for these Western countries.
The religious issue comes into play. Just going to come back to that a little bit. But that, I mean, we heard what it was that these, Islamic militant insurgents needed to stop if the country didn't do something about it, that there would be external intervention. Is this a religious conflict? Is it pitting one religion against another?
It would be wrong to say there is no religious element to the insecurity in Nigeria, for example. There is a religious element, but it's not the only element. And that's what I'm saying. These things are multi-causal. For example, today I'm spending the day at the National Counterterrorism Center, here in Nigeria, at the Office of National Security Advisor. And one of the things we're looking at is trying to develop a sort of media toolkit for how, insecurity is characterized in Africa.
Right.
So you have a situation where we say, for example, we say Islamic terrorism or Fulani herdsmen. The question is, are those terminologies really correct? Let me give you a very clear example of what I mean by this. I told you there is 80 plus armed state groups in Nigeria. So if you are the king of one village and you want to attack, maybe for historical grievances, attack the next village, then you look for, okay, which group can I pay? Can we pay to go and help attack them? And they come and tell you, oh, this Fulani bandit group, if you pay them so amount, they will go and do the job for you. And they're very effective. They're very, merciless. So it's okay. So you pay the Fulani group, they go and attack that village.
Yeah.
When people report what happened, they will say, Fulani attacked us. But the Fulani did not attack you because of religion. They attacked you because it was a business for them.
Right.
So when you are reporting such incident, for example, and the media simply say, oh, Fulani people attacked this village, they give it a religious coloration. Whereas that was simply a sort of business venture for the group. So I think, so it's not just a religious factor, but there is a religious element to it. And the fundamental problem there is the way Islam is practiced in Nigeria. I mean, we practice the worst form of Islam in Nigeria, where I think we are more Catholic than the Pope, so to speak, in the way we practice Islam here. You go to the north, you see our policemen wearing slippers. And I remember challenging them, and I was training them. I said, why are you wearing slippers? They said they pray 5 times a day, so removing the boots is
a bit arduous, right?
and I showed them videos of police all wearing their boots. So that's what I mean, that and that's where they all go for their the police. They wear their boots. Yes, they are not wearing because of so there's a religious element clearly going on in Nigeria, and that is especially in the north because of poverty, illiteracy is worse in the north. Out of school children, for example, is worse in the north. Young girls that are not educated is worse in the north. So as a result of that, you have this army of pliable people that they can use religion to hoodwink and control. So there is a religious element clearly, but that's not the whole picture.
Can we make a connection? Should we make a connection between what would be a quid pro quo between what you said is really needed in terms of intelligence, military intelligence, defense cooperation between Nigeria and the US, or Ghana and the US, and the then access, whether it's unfettered or not, to natural resources, oil in Nigeria, gold in Ghana? Is there a connection, or do these things operate in isolation?
Oh, no. They don't operate in isolation. There is always a connection. I mean, for example, look at what you just said now. Cooperation between US and Nigeria, US and Ghana. We have a cooperation between Nigeria and Ghana.
Yeah.
That's what's lacking in that picture. And that's what I was saying earlier, that yes, US will have this, we have that, but we in West Africa, we don't cooperate among ourselves. In Africa, we don't cooperate among ourselves. When you have a situation like I keep going back to it, where an American citizen can go all over Africa with maybe 2 or 3 visas. A Kenyan will need 30 plus visas to do the same trip. So, which means Americans have easier access to Africa than an African.
So the dream of United States of Africa is what we're missing right now.
Exactly.
It's still a dream.
So that is the problem.
Okay.
So Africans we are not cooperating enough because the problems we face are similar. So we can actually cooperating between nations in Africa or ECOWAS, is a lot easier than United States. But United States, China, whichever country, they always have resource interest in those countries. So the whole idea, therefore, is they will pivot towards, helping their countries. And as you know very well, when America says, "Oh, we are investing, for example, say 20 billion naira in Nigeria security, industry," what that simply means is that they are giving you $20 billion dollars worth of American military products and goods and items.
Dr.
So
Omole,
really, it's not cash.
Sorry to interrupt you. I know we want to let you go very quickly, but I would like to ask you this question, and you can answer it in 1 minute or in one sentence. If Nigeria and the region begin to get this right in terms of security and all these things, economic issues, what will change very first, right? Not just in terms of security, but in how power, trust, and stability are actually experienced on the ground?
Well, initially, I think trust in institutions will rebuild through visible reforms, followed by economic revitalization and reduced violence. On the ground, communities will experience empowered local governance, improved services, and participatory security, fostering stability and collective resilience. So if we get this right, it will be the beginning of a golden age for Africa, or for West Africa as a whole, because this insecurity has it has crushed the development of many countries in Africa. And, it's affecting the economy in a big way, not just in terms of economic output, but also in terms of people, but also in terms of unnecessary spending on defense. Billions of dollars have been spent on defense that should have been going to economic development because of this insecurity. So the earlier we get grips with it, the better. But for me, the solution is not only in cooperating with external powers, but it's also cooperating with neighboring countries, with African countries, because if somebody was saying when Libya, happened, that lots of weapons came to Nigeria from Libya, but the problem is many of those weapons transited through 4 or 5 different other African countries. So if there's better cooperation among African countries and more effectiveness, then they will not allow themselves to become the sort of silent appeasers of insecurity, and we'll be able to work better and secure the continent.
Indeed. Well, I mean, obviously, this is in depth, and this is great that you've been able to have this conversation with us, Dr. Omole. Many layers, intrigues, and that you've been able to open that up for us on Panel 54 today has been amazing. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Thank you.
Thank you. You've been listening to Panel 54, where we rethink the world one African perspective at a time. If it made you pause, reflect, or reframe, share it, start a conversation, and don't forget to tag us in.
Find us on our social media handle at Panel54Pod or your favorite streaming platform. Until next time, stay curious, stay grounded, and keep the lens clear. Panel 54, a global perspective through an African lens.